Hello, community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, C-Suite Trusted Advisor, Board Director, and Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Strategy Consultant, helping members of the C-Suite and their teams reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. This is our second real conversation from the C-Suite in honor of Autism Awareness Month, and I'm so glad to have back with me Ms. Debbie Nix, the Chief People Officer at Easterseals Southern California, and Dr. Nix Leonard, the Clinical Supervisor and Assessor with the Easterseals Autism Services. Welcome back, ladies. I'm so thrilled to have you with me.
Thank you, Dr. Anita. It's great to be back.
Thank you.
Great to be back.
I would like to start this conversation by exploring the healthcare disparities amongst the African American and underserved communities. And I want to include links to the social determinants of health and what Easterseals Southern California is doing to target this through various community partnerships and educational initiatives, such as the Disability Film Challenge, which I found fascinating, the Angel Stadium Sensory Room, and the Caregiver Affinity Group. So first, tell us what you've learned about autism and underserved communities. How often does it show up? How late or how soon is it diagnosed? And what are the steps taken?
All right, so I'll start here, and Debbie, you can certainly chime in. Historically, individuals who identify as Black, Indigenous people of color, individuals from a lower SES, they're likely to receive the same quality of healthcare services compared to other Americans. And so when we talk about healthcare, that's an extension too into the interventions for autism. And so when we talk about just education to caregivers, we talk about access to different services, whether that's behavior therapy, speech therapy, all of that's included. And so there's a healthcare disparity amongst this particular group. And so what that has done, that research has shown, that we have to essentially ramp up our efforts to ensure that our outreach efforts are certainly significant, right? Because these particular groups, our goal is to close that gap, right? Mm-hmm. Closing the gap in autism services and access to equity and in terms of healthcare amongst this particular group, it's what our goal is. And so when we start talking about BIPOC groups, I often really highlight the fact that there's stigma, right, attached to a diagnosis, right, within the Black community. And so what that means is, go ahead.
Just to clarify for our audience, BIPOC is Black and Indigenous people of color.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the Black community, individuals who identify as African American, there is a less likelihood that they're receiving services. There's a less likelihood that they're getting a diagnosis. The research shows that, white Americans, they're diagnosed more. And the reason for that is a decreased education that the individuals in the Black community or BIPOC communities receive. There's the disparity of healthcare access that people of color have access to. And so when we're talking about our outreach efforts, it's really important for us to touch down in those neighborhoods and those communities so that we can give access to those communities and close that gap. And so
can I interrupt you for just a second? I would also assume that if the white community is being diagnosed more frequently, it's probably also happening earlier in the person's life. Do I have that right? And
Absolutely.
so the less frequency and the later in life is certainly providing a hindrance, even by the time you get to them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What is that like?
Well, if you think of, and I'll take the Black community, right? If we think about if you have been coping and dealing, right, with this thing, right, the difficulty of autism, right, but it's not being called autism, right? You are just coping with whatever that is, and you're utilizing whatever it is that you have, whether that's religion, right, your spirituality, your communities that you're connected with, those aunties, those grandmas that are parenting, right? There's a great likelihood that they are dealing and they don't have the awareness and the education to the things that will help them. And so now when it comes and we say, hey, here's some resources, there is some rigidity in accepting that the resources, because they've done this for this long and they haven't been educated, they haven't been offered the services. And now if you think about like when the difficulty of change, when it's time to get to that place of accepting something that's going to help you do it a little bit easier, or help you with this struggle, sometimes that's a little bit easier when you catch that earlier before you kind of get set into this system, right?
Right. And I would guess that until they understand what it is, there might be confusion about this is just a difficult child. They need more attention. We just need to understand what's going on, versus stopping and thinking maybe this is something that we need to look into. Do you see that as well?
Absolutely. And even, we're talking about research, like there's reduced differences in the prevalence of like Black and even Hispanic children compared to white children, because the outreach that's directed toward them, right? They have this awareness and this access to these things. And so, when we're talking about, accepting it, or being aware of it, they don't have that same level of awareness. And that's why it's super important for our outreach to be very specific, to be very targeted to these groups, so that we are essentially giving them, this access to quality services and healthcare as their counterparts.
And I'm curious, does some of that in the non-white communities also attach with shame and embarrassment?
Absolutely. We taken a deep dive into the research, and there's stigma attached to diagnosis, whether that's autism, whether that's mental health. There's big research that talks about that this is going undiagnosed because of that shame that's attached to that, right? That makes me less, right? That makes me appear in a certain way. And so even if there is, a little bit of inkling of maybe there is a thing, but you know what, I don't know if I'm ready to accept that diagnosis, because that comes with something. That comes with a level of a depth that I don't know that I have the capacity to accept right now. If you're, a person of color. And when we talk about some things that we have to make sure that we're considering, it's cultural considerations. Because when we talk about, particular groups, there are things that are important to that culture that could present a barrier to accepting a diagnosis, right? It could present a barrier to even receiving services. And that's something that we have to be mindful of when we're navigating this, and really tailor what we're doing to include the cultural component. That's super, super important, because don't think that you're going to walk into the home of a family who identifies as BIPOC or Black or African American or even Hispanic and give these clinical things, and they just, roll over and say, yes, I've been waiting for you. Thank you for coming in. There's going to be a bit of hesitation. There's going to be lots of questions, and you might be presented with a wall before you really get to that. And that's why it's important to see them as people and to really be able to say, you know what, I've got some cultural similarity. I can come in. I have an understanding of this before I come in with a whole bunch of clinical stuff, right? It's really important to build that rapport so that we really can meet them where they are and give them the things that are going to be helpful along this journey. And it's a journey. It's a journey. You're not going to just come in on that doorstep and things start changing and this butterfly effect starts happening. It's literally is a process, and that's a part of it.
Right when you said meeting people where they are, those very words popped into my head. And I had taken a note when you said the capacity to accept whatever change we're dealing with in life. We have to be mindful of our capacity to accept it at that moment in time, to give grace to ourselves, to step onto the pathway of a new journey that we never even imagined for ourselves. Let's shift gears a little bit to having some fun. Last summer, I remember leaving an AMC movie theater, and I noticed a sign that talked about a sensory room for people on the autism spectrum. So let's talk about that. Let's get to the other end of the spectrum and talk about how we can raise awareness and what some of the joys are that can be experienced.
Yeah, in fact, Crystal and I talked on last week a little bit about all the awesome things that we have the opportunity to do in our communities, just to, embrace that acceptance and offer different ways of, bringing that joy to life for everyone, which sometimes if you make a change or you offer someone, if there's a certain need, you're opening the doors for a lot of people, not just one person, but it's many people. So what you're referring to is at the LA Angels, we have a sensory room. So during the game, when we're all, excited in the midst of, hearing thousands of people, it's an area to go and decompress and just relax, and then be able to go back out into the game with the world. But provides that quiet and that solace just to be able to bring it down and then be able to go back and play ball.
I love that idea. And because I don't know, I'm just going to ask this question. Can anybody go in there that feels like they need a little bit of time out for a minute?
I have not been to the room. Have you, Crystal?
Our VP of clinical quality and training, Alyssa Kavner, she was the leader and spearheaded the development of that room, like really all the way down to the details of the textures of the walls and the colors of different things. It's amazing. That's a great question. I don't have an answer to that. I would imagine as we talk about decompressing, we all need to decompress.
This is what I'm thinking. And that's a great way to bring some inclusivity. We can all decompress together and then go back to the game when we're ready. Wow.
Yeah, and I want to add something, Dr. Anita. And Debbie and I talked about this. Like, Debbie, I think we need a t-shirt because, this came up when we were talking and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is like the best way to really kind of wrap this whole thing up in this pretty bow. It's like the best way to be aware and to accept is to be a part. Right. And this sensory room is the best way that we talk about like accepting, right, and then being a part of this community by saying like, yep, we've got this thing. I think back when I think of the sensory room, I think back to when I was nursing my daughter and how my eyes were pierced looking for nursing rooms when I was at that stage of my life. I can't unsee it now. My daughter is 8 years old, no longer doing that, but I can't help but look for that. And it warms my heart when I see it, right? It warms my heart that there's a place for me or the people like me who were at this stage of their life. And I can imagine that people that come to the stadium and they see that there's a sensory room, like that is a heartwarming notion that says there's a place for me, right? I'm seen, I'm heard in this room. And so I was very excited to think about the idea is like being a part. How can we be a part? By doing simple things like that, being at the Angel Stadium and having a sensory room, that's how we're a part. That's how we accept that this is a part of the journey of people in this community. And, again, even that, being a part is accepting too that not just autism, right, but ADHD and other things, right? I keep a fidget right here with me, and I'm now a part of this community, right? And I know I'm going into like neurodiversity in this umbrella term, but people have to realize that there's autism, but underneath that umbrella as well is other diagnoses that are more common, and that someone sitting right next to you in the C-suite, right, may identify with that very thing. And so if we start to frame things in that way, where it's like, oh, you got a red brick, I got a red brick too. Like, oh, we fit, right? You identify, with that, me too. If we're really making that where it's like we are a part, because we are accepting that this is something that we're connected to, I think that the heartwarming feeling that we get in that sensory room is something that will certainly resonate with so many more people.
I agree. And when you think about the fact that baseball is considered America's pastime, that's a perfect opportunity to be actively engaged in the practice of inclusivity. And when we come back next time, we're going to continue that theme of being aware is to be a part. And we're going to look at things like training in the community at the Norton Simon Museum, the Boys and Girls Clubs of Southern California, and Easterseals Associate Affinity Groups. I'm really excited to explore those topic areas. Community, come back, keep the conversation going with us. It will be our third and final conversation with Ms. Debbie Nix. and Dr. Crystal Leonard of Easterseals Southern California. So please, you don't want to miss this one. If you want to hear our previous conversation, go to the website, dranita.com. At the top, you want to click the link that says Keeping It Real Podcast. While you're there, check out my services and my sources. And please help me out by getting in the flow. Follow, like, and overshare any podcast that helps you reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.